as we go, but I'm just going to stand up here and deliver because that's where the camera is. Okay, so as we begin this unit of study on modern political philosophy, we have to ask ourselves an important question. What is political philosophy? Asking and answering this question will define the terms under which we proceed with this unit. However, it will do more than simply set us up to get through the semester. It will also deepen our understanding and appreciation of the texts we will read, the problems to which our authors were addressing themselves, and the types of questions and problems which we are discussing and not discussing. It will cordon us off from certain kinds of discourse, as well as open up forms of discourse we might not have considered. So to proceed, I will address the following points. Firstly, I'm going to address what do we mean by philosophy? And then I'm going to address the question, what do we mean by political? And then I'll address what do we mean by political philosophy. I think it's working. Yeah, good. All right. The first point's fairly easy. So you should all know what philosophy is, right? But I'm still going to walk us through how to think this through. So philosophy, I take philosophy to be the search for wisdom. Philosophy is thinking about first principles, and the assumptions ought to be that this thinking is grounded upon wisdom of some kind. That wisdom could be received from a prior thinker, or it could be the kind of wisdom that is accessible in the order of the cosmos or in nature. Philosophy is often abstract. That is, it is usually asking a deeper question than, should I study, or will I sleep in today? Rather than addressing the mundane practical question, philosophy would ask, why should I study? And is sleeping longer slothful? And does this matter? I hope you can see the distinction between those two kinds of questions. The first principles are foundational to the decision that you might make about the practical question. If we look at this in terms of religion and theology, you might write a book on prayer, but there are two kinds of books you might write. One is about how to pray, and the other is about why we pray and what it means to pray. They're different questions and different problems to address. So philosophy is the search for wisdom, and that wisdom should cash out in practical terms. But the practical wisdom is not the same as the philosophy undergirding it. Now, political. What do we mean by political? This word is used in a variety of ways, and often when people hear the word politics, they think of government or parliament or legislation or political parties or public policy or Donald Trump or something like that. And these are all related to politics and they're political topics. But the word political has a much broader meaning than what appears in the politics section of the newspaper. I'm going to follow Michael Oakeshott, who's a British philosopher, in what follows and the way he defines the political. And I think he does this in quite a helpful way. I'm just going to use the whiteboard, so I'm going to wander away from the camera. Oh no, I'll still be on camera. Chosen a good angle. Politics. This is the first sort of condition of what we might. This is the first condition of how we might frame politics. Politics is between human beings. Okay, so the first thing is between human beings. So we can't do politics with God. We can't do political things with animals. All right? That sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But it's not necessarily obvious. So humans are political, animals are not political. Secondly, politics occurs where there is plurality and diversity. And I think this is a really interesting point. First of all, there must be more than one person. As soon as two or more people have to share a space or resources or ideas, and there's the potential, at least, for politics. But not only do there have to be more than one person, but politics also occurs where there is diversity of opinions and beliefs and conduct. So the second condition is plurality. Yeah, two kinds of plurality and diversity. Plurality of people and plurality of opinions, beliefs, conduct and activity. people might associate together and have absolutely no disagreement about anything. And they might exhibit no tension between their particular approaches to living. And this would mean there is no political activity. There's no need for it. No diversity, no politics. Third, politics occurs when there is some kind of authority over matters of shared interest in society. So there must be, not only must there be these two things, humans, a plurality of humans and a plurality of opinions, but there also must be some kind of authority. And the authority is over matters of shared interest in society. In other words, once there is someone who is responsible for governing public affairs or shared things, then there is politics. And the fourth condition which Oakeshott outlines is that politics occurs where deliberation about public matters is necessary. This is actually, I think, quite an interesting point, because it means that in a society like, think of the society that Orwell depicts in 1984, that's not a political society, because there's no possibility of deliberation for anyone in that book, right? They have no participation in any kind of deliberative process. In Stalin's Russia, only a very small group of people actually participate in a deliberative process, so most people are not living political lives. We might be political animals, but we're not necessarily actively political. So they're the four conditions under which political things occur. And when political things occur, we can talk about politics and we can think about politics. And that's where we come to political philosophy. So we might move on to define political philosophy as thinking about politics, right, broadly speaking. But before you write that down, I don't think that's quite right. Because thinking about politics requires no more than someone thinking about public policy, or thinking about law, or thinking about parliament, or even thinking about parking fines. All of those things could technically be political thinking. And even if we remove the more action-focused matters from the table, we're still left with things that don't quite fit the category of philosophy, as I defined it before. For example, is a newspaper op-ed about Australian politics by Andrew Bolt in the Courier Mail political philosophy? I would argue not. It might be political thought in a broader category, but it's not political philosophy. Let me give you some more examples. In my own scholarship, I'm a historian of political thought, and I write about texts which constitute thought in relation to politics. And these texts might include Plato's Republic, the Bible, Gratian's Decretum, Eusebius's speech on Constantine's birthday, the Magna Carta, Luther's Table Talk, the private letters of Thomas Hobbes, political pamphlets composed during the exclusion crisis in the 1670s, a sermon preached at St Paul's Cross in the 18th century, Hegel's philosophy of right, the Corn Laws of the 1830s, speeches made in the House of Commons in the 1850s, the novels of Benjamin Disraeli, Constitutional Convention proceedings from the 1890s from Adelaide and Melbourne, propaganda poster from the Bolshevik Revolution, a YouTube video from the No campaign in the lead up to the same-sex marriage postal vote, and an op-ed by Andrew Bolt in the Courier Mail. They're all kind of political thought texts, potentially. I hope you're sort of getting the picture, though, of what's different between political thought and political philosophy. The width and breadth of political thought, generally speaking, is much greater than that of political philosophy. Now, as I said, I'm a historian of those kinds of texts, and I find myself more interested in the sustained arguments of philosophical texts than most of the other ones. But there are plenty of examples where I've had to deal with those other kinds of texts as well. And I'm just using myself as an example here. I'm not drawing attention to myself in any particular way. Let's come back to Oakeshott, though, because Oakeshott's helpful once again on this question of political thought. He calls political thought political utterances, and often those utterances are very practical in nature. They are discourse about practical political beliefs and policies. They identify the situation, they propose a practical solution or a response, or else they defend a prior action. The other kind of political thought is what Oakeshott calls explanatory thought. Rather than proposing a particular agenda or defending a particular action, explanatory political thought is intended to explain and theorise about politics. Another way of putting it is that practical political thought seeks to justify a policy or action. Explanatory political thought seeks to make that policy or action intelligible. It seeks to explain how and why such an action was taken, rather than simply justifying why it should be taken. We can return to the realm of religion to help illustrate this distinction again. Religious belief and practice, or even religious sentiment, are really the equivalent of practical political thought, whereas theology is the conversion of those practices and beliefs into an abstract system. So theology explains religion in some sense, right? Explanatory political thought explains practical political thought. Explanatory political thought is equivalent to political philosophy. It is the search for political wisdom, an abstract political wisdom which will explain and result in practical political wisdom. So, political philosophy is the search for political wisdom. It is the asking of first principles questions about political matters. It is the attempt to explain and explore how, it's an attempt to explain and explore the how and why of political life. I'm going to read out a quote from Leo Strauss, and Strauss is a thinker I have quite a few disagreements with, but he puts it really well. This is what he says about political philosophy. It's quite a long quote. From his essay, What is Political Philosophy? He says, all political action aims at either preservation or change. All political action is guided by some thought of better or worse. But the thought of better or worse implies the thought of the good. The awareness of the good, which guides all our actions, has the character of opinion. It is no longer questioned, but on reflection, it proves to be questionable. The very fact that we can question it directs us towards a thought which is no longer opinion, but knowledge. All political action has then in itself a directedness towards knowledges of the good life, of the good society. But the good society is the complete political good. If this directedness becomes explicit, if men make it their explicit goal to acquire knowledge of the good and of the good society, then political philosophy emerges. End quote. Now, it's quite a long quote, so I'm going to try and distill it down. And I think this is what Strauss is saying. Strauss is saying that political philosophy is the active search for the true conception of the good life and the good society. And this is the journey we're embarking on as we study political philosophy together this semester. We are embarking on a study of texts which help us search for the true wisdom about the good life lived in political opinion. Now, interestingly, this does not mean that every topic we're addressing is obviously political, and not every text is necessarily philosophical, just to really confuse you. Let me give you an example of the latter, a text that's not necessarily philosophical. One of the texts that we're going to read that is barely philosophical at all is Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. Once we get to The Rights of Man, you'll see it's actually much more of a pamphlet than a philosophical discourse. In fact, it reads a little bit like a long polemical op-ed in the newspaper. It's far more practical than explanatory, and Paine really could barely be considered a philosopher at all. However, this is not a problem, because we will be looking at Paine from the perspective of philosophers. We will be approaching his text philosophically and looking for those first principles which he thinks undergirds true wisdom about the good political life. What about the topics that are not particularly political? Well, in one sense, most of our time will be spent discussing issues that are not on the surface political. For example, we'll be discussing human nature more than any other topic this semester. Is this a sensible use of our time, you might ask? Wouldn't it be better to discuss different kinds of regimes and the various types of rule and possible systems of government? These are all more obviously political and they're interesting questions. However, Paradoxically, perhaps I'm expecting that we'll barely touch on those topics at all. Instead, we'll be tackling questions which bear quite directly on those topics and which will affect how one answers the philosophical questions about regime type and political leadership and lawmaking and so forth. And these questions include these. What is a human? I'm not going to write all these down, I'm just going to write some of them down. What is a human? What is man's, or what is the human, what is the natural condition for humans? What is man's natural condition? I'm going to stop writing now. What is man's current condition? What is man's ideal condition? So these questions are actually at the forefront of all of the readers on our reading list. And the way they answer that question directly affects their prescriptions about politics. Here's another question. Why are we political? What causes us, or what caused us, to be in political community in the first place? Was it human nature? Was it the fall? Was it some sinister outside force? Another question. How does politics help or hinder reaching the ideal human condition? If we're not in the ideal human condition, how does politics help us reach that, if at all? And should it? Another question. How should we understand freedom? Another question. What role does reason play in political deliberation and political life? What is the place of reason in politics? How should history inform our political life and our political thinking? And so on. Notice that in that list of questions, there's not a single one about forms of government, parliament, or anything like that. So the question is, in addressing those questions, are we even dealing with political philosophy? The answer is yes. Because these questions are being addressed in the context of discussions of political matters in the texts that we're reading. The texts are all texts of political thought. And so the discussion of these first principles is couched in a context of political discussion. We're not reading, I can't even give an example. Doesn't matter. Roger Scruton's On Human Nature is not a political book. But in other contexts, he might discuss the same things and relate that directly to politics. If you want to read about Roger Scruton, I'll talk about Roger Scruton, just ask how much. She's the new expert on Scruton. Even if we were to read a text that did not bear on politics directly, like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, okay, that's not a political text technically, right? Even if we read that, we could still find a range of philosophical reflections that we, as people practicing philosophy, could apply to political wisdom, or to the search for political wisdom. And the fact is that those kinds of questions that I listed off before are foundational to this search for political wisdom. No doubt we will spend some time discussing the more obviously political questions about regime and so on, but these questions will arise out of a carefully considered discussion of those prior questions. Questions which arise in our minds and in the minds of the thinkers that we are studying precisely because they are wanting to reflect on politics. Now I want to throw to you, do you have any follow-up questions about that? That's the end of the lecture component.
So that list you have up there,
yeah.
Deliberation seems to be the one that is the most out of place.
Yep.
I can see.
Okay.
So, yeah, just it being up there just seems to be.
So how's it? And just that's fine. I'm just wondering how you see that as out of place.
Well, politics obviously has to be between two thinking creatures.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
we're going with humans. Plurality, diversity, pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Authority. Yeah, that has to be something to sort of enforce the politics, but deliberation doesn't feel like it's required for something to be political.
Okay.
Just because it could be a political action by a king to force his subjects to do something. There's no deliberation in that act, but it would certainly be political, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. I see. Do other people want to respond to that or think about that a bit more?
How do you define deliberation?
Conversation trying to reach an agreement or an end, at least.
I suppose politics is something that's all about trying to reach.
Definitely doesn't necessarily happen.
So your point holds, except that you might say, yeah, the outcome of the king's decision has political. But I'll maybe, and I'm not necessarily even saying that this is absolutely right. So I think it's good to raise questions about it. Right? I think Oakeshott would argue at least. And I suppose thinking it through, I'd probably agree with him at this point that just because there are political consequences does not mean that politics happen in the lead up to those consequences. Yeah?
To me, maybe the sort of deliberation introduces, it seems a little circular to me.
Sure.
Because as soon as you have deliberation, you have two people, or presumably more than one person.
Yeah.
To deliberate means, I think it introduces the idea of reason, but whose reason?
It does introduce the idea of reason, yeah, absolutely.
But then you come back to authority.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like you have to have in the authority, which is usually like one thing, which is the authority for deciding on multiple things. You have to deliberate, which means there's more multiplicity, which means you've got to decide again, but what's the thing deciding? So it seems circular to me.
Sure, it might be. Well, think about it like this, and Oakeshott, this is how Oakeshott frames it. He says there has to be a possibility for change in who is doing the deliberating, who the authority is. So if there's no possibility of changing the authority, then it's not a political situation. So there in fact there actually has to be kind of a possibility of change and a process of deliberation around how that happens. I think that's how those two things. So if you think about this in terms of change as well, possibility of change, and it could be a possibility of change in authority, but it could also be change in policy as well. It doesn't necessarily directly answer what you were saying, but just adds another layer to that.
I feel like it's almost that deliberation validates the first point between human beings. The reason why it can't be between God and between animals is because deliberation doesn't take place there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, animals don't have reason to, they don't have the capacity for reasoning to deliberate. And God is an authority that by definition, the god of theism, or even actually really the god of theism, it's not really the god of because in a way the Greek gods are kind of political because they're interacting with humans and it's a bit kind of confused, right? But you're quite right. By definition, God is not part of this. It's a puppet or he has his own independent authority.
What about other celestial beings then?
Like angels. Well, it's a very Augustinian question that you're asking because he talks about angels for hundreds of pages in the City of God, which is not exclusively a political text, I suppose. I guess they probably have their own politics, maybe. I mean, if you read Milton, they certainly seem to.
I think there's so much caught up in the idea of deliberation, but you would come down, like the question of angels, you would come down. I think finitude is key. Like only people that are finite can deliberate. If you're infinite and you know everything, there's nothing to deliberate about.
Yeah.
So, and that also means you have to be open to the idea that you are finite. If you think you're infinite,
Yeah.
there's no possibility of change either. So there's so much caught up in that.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Depends what you.
It's kind of a rich conception in that way, isn't it?
You can think about reason as an angel. You can think about, it's not a person, but it stands above a person, something more fixed. It's not like a concept that you interact with that isn't necessarily human. You can think about reason sort of as an angel.
How would you actually, let's think about this just on that. Think about the difference between, if you go to Milton's Paradise Lost, because that's what we all love to do at CHC, if you go to Paradise Lost, you have two sets of angels. One is obviously more depicted as more political than the other, correct? There's actually no deliberation in the heavenly angels, I would argue. They don't actually work things out, they just do it because they know what to do and they're only given orders. And they just act them out happily and cheerfully. Whereas there's actually a parliament in hell. So there's actually different conceptions of that too. That maybe that helps illustrate the difference in some ways, in a kind of weird way. Because there is reason. Is there even reason being utilised by the heavenly angels in Milton? I'm not sure. Not in a political sense, I don't think. In other ways.
Yeah, it's God's reason, and the angels just defer to that, right?
They just implement His reason. So they certainly use reason in other ways, obviously, because they discuss things without it. Good point though, to take. Think about what that means. So is that a good start? Is everyone tracking there? Does everyone agree with the definition of political philosophy and the distinctions between philosophy and thought, or political philosophy and political thought? Sorry. You get yet to convince you. All right. Cool. So that's all I'm going to say about this class. Who just read Hobbes?